This is workshop 1 of 4, and you're going to hear myself and my lovely colleagues say a number of times today words like connect, empower, integrate, and these are words that we are aiming to make sure you go away from this workshop series being able to do, to connect nature with finance, to integrate nature with finance, and to empower you to be able to do those things. So this is going to be very practical, and I'm really thrilled to be here because after the publication of the TNFD and its LEAP guidance, we are beginning the journey towards that integration, towards that connection. And so on that, quite a functional slide. It's the slide that begins most of the biodiversity consulting's decks. And the story of the image I'd love Malcolm to tell before we introduce ourselves a bit more formally. So Malcolm, come on up.
Thanks, Grant. So yeah, before we sort of launch into it, we thought maybe we could tell a little story. This, perhaps this is a slightly funny image to have on a presentation to a financial audience. It's a guy standing on the top of a hill in Kenya, in East Africa. And what he's doing, he's from a local conservation NGO, and he's doing what ecologists call a vantage point survey, which basically means standing on the top of a hill and counting and what you can see. And in this case, he is looking for vultures and other birds of prey. And the story about how this came about is, a story that connects finance and nature in quite a surprising way. So there was a consortium of investors, multilateral investors, and development finance from the US to start with, but then as anchor investors, but bringing in a whole set of other investors, supporting the development of renewable energy in Kenya. Critical for both livelihood and sustainable development goals. And if you look at a map of Kenya and you think about, okay, where are the best places to put a wind farm, it tends to be on the top of hills, where you have the wind that comes up the sides of the hill. Unfortunately, those are also the areas where vultures, big, large, heavy, soaring birds of scavengers, they use the thermals going up the side of the hill to lift themselves up into the air so they can move and they can search for their food. And so if you put a wind turbine blades spinning very fast, very hard to see when you're close up, in an area where you have slow-moving heavy birds coming, you end up with a risk of collisions. And vultures are, almost every species of vulture are now critically endangered, which means that more than 80% of them the population has declined by more than 80% over 3 generations. A lot of that is to do with, not to do with energy, it's to do with poisoning. So when farmers protect their cattle, they poison, maybe they'll leave a carcass out to poison it to kill lions, so that lions don't come and eat their cattle. So there's a social issue there. But that means that there are relatively few vultures left, and so any extra mortality can be very significant. And in this case, there was a local NGO that were very informed about this, and they were able to take that campaign to this power project, which had already started. So capital had already been allocated and was being spent, but then it was halted. The development was slowed down because of concerns around vultures. And obviously at the time when your project is being developed and you've allocated the capital but you've got no returns, that's the most expensive time of the project. So this was a material issue for the project. So there was a long involved process based on training people, doing some surveys to understand what the real level of risk was. And the project came up with a mitigation plan. So they have now observers on the hills who, when they see vultures coming in proximity with the turbines, they can slow the turbines down. It started off like that and then moved to an automatic system later. And there is, whatever they do, there is still going to be some mortality if there's a project in that place. And so they've started to invest in some positive solutions. So as I said, the biggest threat to vultures is not the wind farms, it's poisoning. So they are funding a program which is supporting local communities to protect their their cattle without having to resort to poisoning. So there's a very interesting story. This took more than 10 years. This process between finding out the issue and the project is still going, but the fact that the project had been planned, there was an issue which had not really been fully recognized. Stakeholders had not necessarily been fully consulted, or maybe the lessons hadn't come through, created that material issue for finance. So somewhere, for someone who is one of these investors, maybe a couple of decimal points changed on the rates of return, or a couple of percentage points changed. But if you dig into why that happened, nature was at the heart of it. So we just wanted to start with that, since we had this photo, a little story that says that nature and finance can be connected in quite surprising ways. And given we have all these different layers in the financial system, sometimes unpicking that and working out, why did that number change slightly? What is the effect of nature on that can be quite challenging. Yeah. So,
thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why, and skipping, I suppose, on to introductions in a second. Actually, no, we'll do the agenda first. It's one of the reasons why I joined the Biodiversity Consultancy. My background was in finance, and I think really what Malcolm's story illustrates is that we have this opportunity today to bring the ground truths, the ground level knowledge up through with a variety of tools and technologies that we have to the financial actors that are behind the funding of these activities. And it's really that connection, that integration that we, as we go through these workshops, are looking to empower you to be able to start and to do yourselves. Just in terms of the agenda for today, we've got this welcome now. There's a number of coffee breaks and bathroom breaks built into the day, but overall, in the morning, this is setting the scene. How did we get here? Why are we here? Where are we in terms of the regulatory developments, in terms of what policymakers are doing? And then in the afternoon, we'll be talking a little bit more about TNFD itself, about the LEAP process, and about what you as financial institutions can do to be ready to begin a LEAP exercise. So beginning to get into that how-to, but very much today is about introducing all those concepts, introducing all those tools that are going to be needed moving forward. And I'll talk through this again once we've introduced some of the key material. So we've touched on it a little bit, and I can now welcome Inga to the stage as well. So myself, Grant Rudgley, Director in the Nature Finance team. I began my career as a sell-side analyst covering the energy sector. Energy sector became something where I was raising a lot of money for clean tech companies in the Cambridge area in the UK. That became sustainable finance. Sustainable finance became a focus on the nature finance topic around 6-7 years ago. And now I find myself at the category leader for advice about the natural world. And it's a real pleasure to work with the likes of Malcolm and colleagues that have this deep knowledge about how to manage and mitigate the impact on the natural world. Malcolm?
Thanks, Grant.
Yeah.
So my name is Malcolm Starkey. I'm head of the Science and Innovation function at the Biodiversity Consultancy, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I'm an ecologist by background. I spent many years working in the forests of Central Africa. And about 10 years ago, I moved into the Biodiversity Consultancy because I'd been working as a scientist and as in an NGO. And working from the outside, it's quite hard to engage with companies, but when you're in these landscapes, you see sometimes the biggest opportunities and impacts on nature come from companies and finance. So I moved to working with the Biodiversity Consultancy because really we found that actually if you're working with finance, with companies, and helping people understand the implications of some of the decisions they're making, then actually that's the greatest way to drive positive change. And I'll hand over to Inka.
Thank you. Good morning also on my behalf. My name is Inka Musta and I come from a company called Luontoa. I'm one of the founders of the company and CEO. My background is also in forest ecology. So I'm ecologist by training, have worked in forest sector in organizations such as Metsähallitus, Finnish Forest Industries Federation and UPM, where I globally led their forest-related responsibility agenda. then I decided to move on to consultancy to my own company, wanted to change the world with our own work, and really honored to be here today with these great colleagues. And my role here is to bring knowledge on Finnish markets, on Finnish regulation here, and also on the latter workshops. I'm the Finnish language expert, so you're also free to use Finnish on those workshops with me. Thank you.
Thanks both. So yeah, Malcolm, a little bit.
Yeah, so just a very brief introduction to who we are and the Biodiversity Consultancy. We have a very self-explanatory name. We're a small consultancy, about between 80 and 90 people now, based out of Cambridge in the UK. And we are people with a mission to support business and finance to understand their interactions with nature and use that to move towards delivering on global goals for nature. And we work with individual companies and organisations, but also very much we're seeing it as a system change issue. And so we work with many of the sort of cross-cutting initiatives, whether that's the Science Based Targets Network, whether that's industry groupings like the Textile Exchange or the Watch and Jewellery Initiative or the Fashion Pact, and organisations like TNFD and WBCSD to bring our expertise on biodiversity, and in particular biodiversity measurement, into those frameworks in a pragmatic and useful way. Because our perspective is very much, if you can start to quantify and measure both the impacts and opportunities of actions on nature, that makes it really tangible and is a basis for objective decision making. It doesn't always have to be incredibly precise, but some kind of quantification really goes beyond the sort of qualitative types of assessments that traditional environmental impact assessments typically use. And yeah, we work with some of the largest financial and financial organizations and companies in the world, developing biodiversity strategies and implementing work programs. Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm.
And yeah, Luontoa.
Inka?
Put my mic on. So briefly about Luontoa, don't be worried if you have not heard about us yet. We are quite a new company, established in 2022, and we are also a biodiversity consultancy company. You mentioned you are a small company. We are even smaller. There are 6 experts in our company. Our background is in forest industry, so most of our experts come from there, and that gives, of course, good basis to biodiversity work, since forest sector has been forerunner in biodiversity work. And our purpose is to support companies in halting nature loss and accelerate the systemic change needed for nature-positive future. And we provide top biodiversity consultancy services for companies and financial sector with specific focus on land use sectors such as forestry, agriculture, energy, textiles. We give advisory on frameworks such as CSRD, TNFD, SBT, and so on. And our strength is probably that we have strong knowledge about fieldwork. So we really have worked in the forest. We know what really happens in the nature, and we combine that with latest scientific information. Thank you.
Thanks, Inka.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so let's continue from here. So who we are, who do we have here today? So today, all the program participants are here. In the later workshops, you will be divided in 2 groups. Group A being the institutional investors and asset managers, and Group B being the banks. And as you can see from the logos of the organizations, our group is very versatile, and many types of organizations, from big banks, investment banks, to pension funds, to private foundations and other organizations. So I'm sure that this versatility enriches the learning experience that we're going to have here, and hope we all get to learn from each other during these workshops. Back at you.
Yeah, thanks, Inka. Okay, so you've heard a little bit about us, and now a little bit about yourselves. I think we've got about 60% of you that officially wear a sustainability or responsible investment hat, and then 40% of you that maybe don't have it in your title, but it exists on your desk burning a hole and being something that you need to pay more attention to. There's a lot of mentees and Q&As in the workshop today. This is the only one where it's going to be lecture style rather than workshop style, and as a result we are trying to balance that out because we don't want to go too much into the detail all the time. It would be great to stay at a certain level and then have you ask us where you'd like us to talk a little bit more. So 2 requests for you. First request is in the Q&A sections, be mean to us. And the second request is, as we go through, if a concept or word doesn't make sense, just please raise a hand and ask. I think that's just easiest. Please just jump in. And if that doesn't happen throughout the day, then we'll either be very worried because it means that you haven't understood what we're saying, or very happy because we've been so clear in everything that we're saying. But to begin us getting used to the mentees and getting us warmed up, it's not a very sustainable sport or hobby to have, but I follow motorsport because my father was very into motorsport, and so I couldn't come to Finland without asking a question to everybody. So this isn't a nature-related question, but everyone needs to start using the Menti, so we'll start here. This isn't a nature-related question, but I need to know who the greatest Finnish racing driver is. Particularly following Formula One, there's a vast overrepresentation of Finns. It's 5.5 million people, yet quite a number of Formula One world champions and rally driving world champions. Apparently you have a skid test during your driving test, but then I was told last night you get to do the skid test with spikes in your tires. So anyway, who's the greatest? So we've got 4 Formula One drivers and 2 rally drivers here. As you can see, Valtteri Bottas is now modeling the Keke Rosberg 80s look, which I think is a sign of the times. Yeah, so who's the greatest Finnish racing driver? Okay, so everyone's ready with the Menti. That's awesome. So this link for the Menti in code, it will stay the same throughout today. So we'll just advance through them, and so if you just refresh your phone, it should update as we go. That worked very well. There's a Menti add-in for PowerPoint now, if anyone ever wants to use it, and it seems to work. Awesome. So, no, my clicker stopped working. Excellent. So why are we here? I'm going to hand back over to Malcolm now, just to give us the landing. Oh yeah, we will. The plan is to share them at the end of the session. Absolutely. So you can read that competition law statement in your own time. Yeah. Clicker's now back working. Malcolm.
Thank you. So why are we here? We're here to talk about nature, and in more particularly about biodiversity. Biodiversity is living nature, and that's one part of the rest of nature, which also includes non-living nature, so water, soils, the atmosphere. And biodiversity is amazing. We are part of biodiversity. Biodiversity is what produced us. But this is the basis for why we need to understand these interactions more clearly. As Lasse said, the biodiversity is a broad concept. It's all of life on Earth. It's more than just individual species. It's ecosystems and how those ecosystems sustain themselves and interact, whether that's a tropical mangrove ecosystem, a coral reef, a tropical forest, or an agricultural mosaic mixed with natural habitats. These are all ecosystems of different scales. So the definition of biodiversity is the diversity of life on Earth, from ecosystems to species to genes, and then the interactions between them and the interactions between living nature and non-living nature. And so we'd like to introduce some of these concepts. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with some of them, but just making sure that we're starting with a common understanding. And, why does this matter? Well, we are living through a biodiversity crisis, a nature crisis. It's sometimes been called the sixth great mass extinction, for example. But essentially, there are many, many changes happening due to human activities which are affecting biodiversity, and then those effects on biodiversity are coming back to affect us. So some of these you can classify through standard terms. So one of them is land use change. So, for example, clearing of natural habitat for a mine, for a plantation, for a real estate development, for example. We're using up more and more of the world for anthropogenic land uses. Another one is the impacts of climate change. Wildfires in forests. I'm sure you've seen the news around the wildfires in Canada a few years ago. There are more this year. Extremes of heat and drought are contributing to much more extensive fires than we've seen, which have impacts on the ecosystem. The forest that regenerates after that is not exactly the same as the one before, and in some cases, forests some elements of it do not completely regenerate. And whilst those climate change impacts that we see on land are some of the most visible, they're also happening in the ocean. A colleague last night was saying that the waters here are nearly 20 degrees at this time of year. Beautiful for a swim. If you look at the North Atlantic surface temperatures at the moment, they are more than 5 degrees above the average for this time of year. And under the water, the oceans are warming as well. If you look at coral reefs, they're experiencing a huge amount of heat stress. The number of days in the year where the temperature is above the level that the corals are used to is increasing every year, and that's leading to these bleaching events where the reefs could become completely white and lose a large proportion of their biodiversity. So even where we don't necessarily see them, these impacts are happening. Pollution is another one. There's some very graphic images of the impacts of plastic pollution in the oceans. It's something that we can see, we can hear about. There are pictures of whales whale sharks here, eating plastic bags. There are many stories around seabirds that have been found dead, and when you look in the stomach, they're full of pieces of plastic. But then there's other forms of pollution, whether that's the toxic emissions from the sulfur dioxide, for example, from power stations, or hot water. Hot water can be a pollutant. It can change the environment. If the hot water is used to cool a power station and then it's released into a cool stream, that can completely change the ecosystem. And then direct use and exploitation of wildlife. In some cases, wildlife is very important for food. I spent many years working in Central Africa, where food from the forest, meat from the forest, is a very, very important part of the diet and of the economy. But in some places, it's not sustainable, and that is really changing the ecosystems, because the large-bodied species, which are the ones that tend to be hunted, are also the ones which disperse seeds of trees. And so over time, the composition of the forest changes, and the ability of the forest to recover can be reduced. So this is what's happening all around the world, to different extents in different parts of the world. And that's now having, environmentalists have documented the impacts for nature of that for a long time. But now we're starting to realize and observe the impacts that this is having on us as well. So, why do we care about this? I've pressed the wrong one. There we go. So, one of the first ones is, there is a risk of ecosystems collapsing, and that can have impacts on us because the biosphere, so the grouping of living nature and non-living nature, the biosphere, that underpins the global economy. There's an often cited figure that about half of the global economy is highly or moderately dependent on nature. But in reality, all the economy depends on nature to some extent. We can't just live in little bubbles isolated from nature. And there are starting to be material impacts. So if we think about food production, there are a small number of crops which produce the vast majority of calories that are consumed around the world. Wheat, maize, and rice, for example. They produce about half the calories. And those crops, on average, about 16% every year are damaged by invasive species. So at the moment, we're lucky that at a global level, the production of food is sufficient. But as we go into climate crisis, and there are risks of droughts in some areas of the world, every bit of production is going to be important. And 16% of loss, right now that's just an impact for individual farmers and individual people, but in the future that could become something that's systemic and can have a global impact. And that's connected to nature. If we take the example in the UK, we have invasive species of deer which have been introduced, but historically we have eliminated all large predators. So there is no means of keeping them in check. And so you have agricultural areas which basically provide some great food from them. We have much warmer winters now, so the mortality in the winters for the deer is much, much lower. The survivability is much higher. And so there's a exploding deer population, and it's becoming an increasing impact for farmers. So that's just one example of how changes in nature come back and hit individuals and then can feed into the economy. There are many others. We lived through recently the global pandemic. There's very good evidence that the rate at which diseases move from wildlife into humans is much greater in areas where there's high levels of habitat loss and deforestation. Bats, for example, if they are highly stressed, they can have their immune systems work less well, and therefore they have higher levels of virus in their blood, which can increase the risks of transmission. So, then this is well documented for diseases like Zika or Nipah virus, for example. So there are many issues and risks, which we would call systemic risks, which are emerging. And as Lasse showed another version of this slide earlier, these are now being recognized as potentially most significant risks. And what I'd like to point out here is on the right, we have a list of what the WEF considers the biggest risks on a 10-year timescale, and the top 4 of those are environmental, and each of those in some way is connected to nature. And each of these can come back to impact individuals or organizations in different ways. And as awareness of this is growing, there are more and more assessments of, what does that actually mean for the financial system. So, we have, again, Lasse mentioned the Dasgupta review, which summarized a whole set of research on this, and clearly looked at the connection between natural capital, nature, and the economy. And we have increasingly more specific examples. So on the right, this was a study by the Dutch Central Bank, which estimated that more than half of the GDP in the Netherlands was from companies who were highly or moderately dependent on nature. So there are potentially some significant risks there. And if we look more broadly, we'll be talking about the Netherlands, in the EU, but if you look more broadly in the developing world, in many countries, more than half of the GDP is based on natural capital, on things like fishing, forestry, and so on. It's a very very significant part. And so, these are the sort of the idea of understanding these systemic risks, which translate into potentially for individual organizations and people into what we call physical risks. So, the risk of wildfire, the risk of loss of pollinators for agricultural crops, for example. So that's one reason why there's increasing attention on the role of nature. the second is a bit more perhaps short-term and tangible, is around transition risk. So which is essentially saying, well, the world is waking up to these challenges, and therefore the regulatory frameworks and the policy frameworks within which we all operate are also changing, and we need to be aware of that, because that can come back and have implications for us. So, if we look over approximately the last sort of 25, 30 years, there was a beginning of some very early disclosure frameworks, very much on a voluntary basis, with organisations like CDP, the very first version of the Global Reporting Initiative, for example. And what we see is there's been an acceleration of focus on how to methods for understanding interactions with nature. So, for example, through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or TCFD, and the setting of goals, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, and now the Global Biodiversity Framework from a couple of years ago, and much more detailed disclosure and reporting frameworks. And a few years ago, we looked at the evolution of environmental legislation in countries around the world, and we found that more than 100 countries had mention of the mitigation hierarchy, so the need to avoid and reduce impacts and then maybe restore or offset them, were mentioned in legislation or emerging in policy. So the level of attention to nature is greatly increasing. And then the third sort of real reason is biodiversity is wonderful. It matters. People care about it. These are a selection of photos from our company's social WhatsApp chat from people's work trips and other visits. Snow leopards, nudibranch in the Philippines, arola, the bird in East Africa, for example. And this creates, unlike carbon, CO2, climate change, it's pretty intangible. It's pretty hard to visualize that. But biodiversity, it has a face. There are species that represent biodiversity, which means people do start to care about it. And that can create new risks for organizations, like the example of the vultures I talked about. Vultures, perhaps not the prettiest species. They're very dramatic. They're very amazing. They play an incredibly important ecological role. But there are people who care about them and who were able to bring that to the table in a way that actually affected that wind farm project. So something very much to be aware of. And I'll hand over now to Grant.
Thanks, Malcolm. My mic back on? Yeah, awesome. So, yes, Matt, thanks, Malcolm, for the setup. So one of the ways that this tries to be wrapped up, and there was a participant that came in this morning that was thinking about, I think, investment strategies based on planetary boundaries. So planetary boundaries are in essence, a way of thinking about the world in a similar way to maybe the way that you might think about measuring your blood pressure. So as you measure the blood pressure, the blood pressure's high. It's an indication that your body might be stressed in some way or out of balance in some way. And that's the way to think about the planetary boundaries, that there are these systems that maintain the stability and resilience of our planet, such as climate system or the regulatory services that filter pollutants like nitrogen and so on. And these systems are all under stress, and 6 of them have passed the boundary at which they can operate safely. And I mean, it's a really simple message, but just to drive it home, why has this happened? I mean, in very simple terms, natural capital has been exchanged for produced capital and continues to be. It's the very definition of an unsustainable situation. So the resources that are in the natural world are used and abused to an extent which is unsustainable, and this is reflected on the chart on the right-hand side. That does come from Dasgupta, but was extracted from somewhere else. So what we're talking about is how do we decouple? How do we halt and reverse this situation? But what's behind it? Well, what's behind it is, for me, in the simplest terms, the great acceleration. So this is how, since the 1950s, but particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the WTO agenda in the early 1990s, there has been a hockey stick growth in our GDP, in our produced capital, in the things that we measure always, rightly or wrongly. And at the same time, there has been a hockey stick increase in degradation. So we have tropical forest loss, coastal nitrogen, oceanatification. I'm not going to read them all. It's all the same, right? So this is often referred to as the great acceleration. And therefore, the goal to, say, halt and reverse nature loss, well, halting is still a little way off. So this underscores the urgency of action. Just to put a framing around some of what Malcolm was talking about, Malcolm touched on a number of different pressures. We spoke about invasive species, but also talking about how these different pressures interact to result in a degradation, a decline in nature, in what we would call the state of nature. So the flow here is that something happens, company activities, economic activities, our behavior on the right-hand side, and those activities place pressures on biodiversity, on nature. So we change the way the land's used, we exploit resources, we alter the climate, we pollute, we introduce invasive species, or we create a situation where invasive species can proliferate. So these are the five, you'll hear them referred to as 5 pressures or 5 drivers of nature loss. These are the categories to be aware of. So often things are organized in this way. Those then have impacts on different ecosystems. We'll come to the realms in a bit as an organizing concept. And then all of these then affect the state of nature. So this is then, if you like, the outcome. So we might see species population decreasing or habitat sizes decreasing. So there are a number of state of nature measurements, metrics that you can use to observe the outcomes of this. We'll come to this later on in the day. You'll see some financial products where people are incentivizing companies to behave in a certain way. Sometimes their incentives are around reducing the pressure, and sometimes their incentives are around proving a certain outcome. It can be both. Tends to be more expensive to prove outcomes than to measure reduction in pressure. But yeah, I mean, this context, I mean, it's reflected in the decline of biodiversity. So the Living Planet Index is a measure of the state of the world's biological diversity based on population trends. So it's down. And then on the right-hand side, you see the number, the cumulative extinctions based on evaluated species. So up. Inca is managing the time today, so I've got my ironer in out the corner. I think we're good. Cool. Finance. Where does finance come into all of this? Slightly complicated diagram, but hopefully it speaks to you, first of all. I'll explain it now. So for me, finance is in essence a part of the accelerant, because when something is financed, particularly, I mean, let's think about debt finance. Debt finance is very simply making an assumption about the future, borrowing from the future in order to pay for something to be started today. So as a result, it's really accelerating, pulling, pushing, whatever you want to describe it, it's pulling people towards that future outcome. Okay, now if that future outcome is to mine a resource as quickly as possible with no consideration to the impacts that would have, then you'd pull the operation towards that outcome. You know, and finance can do that. Or equally, finance could operate in a different way. It could incentivize or pull activities towards slightly different outcomes if the value of operating a different way was recognized. That brings me back to the word integrate connect nature to finance. So that's the big picture here. In terms of the diagram, I mean, really, this is the big picture I just described was around outcomes as the result of capital being allocated. So when capital is allocated, it has an impact, but it equally extracts services from the natural world or expects services from the natural world, which produces outcomes both for us in terms of produced capital and in terms of nature, in terms of the impact on natural capital. In the middle, inside the purple, what's actually going on here? Well, to kind of, and this is all operating within the biosphere that Malcolm identified. What's going on here is you've got, on one side, on the buy side, as it were, you've got all of the capital to be deployed from company treasuries, from pension funds, that comes from individuals, from family office, from wherever, right? So all of that's on the buy side, and then that's deployed through those that actually act in the economy, which then generates more capital, which gets reinvested, and so on and so forth. So it's a wheel that spins and can spin increasingly fast. All right, so key takeaways from this first section. Nature underpins life in the whole economy. Malcolm made this point that try not to focus on that. 50% is heavily or moderately dependent. It's all nested. It's all ultimately dependent. I don't think any of us could think that if there was a collapse in yields in Latin America because of a combination of climate change, land degradation, and mismanagement of the water resources, that wouldn't have knock-on effects in the rest of the world. Of course it would. There are cascade risks that just ripple out. So this idea that there's not an interconnection of financial systems with natural systems is of course false. Nature loss and biodiversity decline has been accelerating. Climate and nature are inextricably linked. Climate change is only one driver, only one pressure upon natural systems. Nature-related physical risks, they are being acknowledged, but they're not really yet being managed. We have those transition risks that are rising. Supervisors and regulators are moving. Malcolm touched on the frameworks that those guys are using. And last of all, we have this role of finance. The finance, maybe it can be more than just passive. In terms of your motivations, you were asked when you kind of applied to be a part of the program about, why were you interested? And your motivations, they did fall into these boxes. So, on the physical risk side, there was this acknowledgement, well, we work a lot with forestry assets. We want to understand what's happening on the ground. We've got some reporting coming up against our physical risks. We want to maybe integrate that into risk assessment. Equally, on the transition side, you want to keep up with trends. That makes a lot of sense. And then on the intrinsic side, yeah, there was this desire to protect nature and your role as individuals in halting and reversing nature loss. That's a lot of scene setting there, but we almost probably certainly missed something because we're trying to cover everything. Whenever you begin something, you try and cover everything. So what do we miss? So I'm leaving this open. This Menti is open-ended. Just if you thought that we missed something, drop a word in. I'd be really curious to hear. So those that want to do this on their computers, I think the code should be here. The code is there. Amazing. So yeah, miss about the reasons for being here. What do we miss out of what was covered? So yeah, where we're headed. All right, in simple terms, this is about empowerment. I've used that word, I think, a few times already. It's really about empowering you to use the TNFD disclosure recommendations and specifically the TNFD LEAP process to understand your interface with nature. So from my perspective, the purpose of TNFD is about improving the intelligence that we and that the financial community have about what's going on in the natural world. So that making that relationship more, making that interface more visible, understanding that interface, because the theory of change here is that by making how business is harming nature and damaged nature is harming business, making our understanding or intelligence about that better, the theory of changes is that there's an incentive to change it, and then there's an incentive of finance to accelerate and pursue a slightly different pathway. In the middle here, just in terms of the results of that, the top image is just trying to represent how you could veer an intercropping or mosaic approach in a landscape, have a harmonious production technique for various crops versus maybe a monocropping or very, very biodiversity poor approach. So just highlighting which of those approaches might be the most resilient, might be the most sustainable, and then this is all what TNFD in terms of its disclosures is trying to pull us towards disclosing. Decision useful disclosures. Very briefly, like what's TNFD? Again, some of you might be very familiar, some of you might not be familiar at all. So yeah, it's a set of disclosure recommendations for identifying and reporting on nature-related financial risks and factors. I mean, I've focused this a little bit for financial institutions, but it's a disclosure framework. It's voluntary for now. Of course, TCFD and what's now been merged into ISSB and so on. This is becoming mandatory, but it's disclosure. It's voluntary for now. Of course, the theory here being is as soon as factors are disclosed, then regulators and supervisors say, well, these are very material, you must disclose them on a, it's mandatory for you to do this now. So some people, of course, are playing a game of chicken with the ECB where they don't want to disclose things, but as soon as they do, then everyone will need to. But that's just the situation. And it's relevant for both corporates and financial institutions. And a quick point there on the supervisors and on the disclosures. Back in 2018, I vividly remember a European bank still putting in its report that had no material climate-related risks because of which seems like an absurd thing to say now, of course. So I think that we are on a journey forward here where more disclosures will make that an indefensible statement in relation to nature. And then in terms of what is LEAP, LEAP is about, first of all, locating that interface within nature, locating that interface with nature, and then saying, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that interface mean to me? Like, let me understand that. How am I impacting the vultures, or how do I depend on that water catchment area? So what does that mean for the business activity? And then based upon that, well, what are the risks and opportunities to my business? Like, is there a forward-looking scenario here where those services might go away, or is there a piece of regulation that means if I don't manage this correctly, that might be a problem? So locating that interface, what does that actually mean? Understanding what's going on there, evaluating that, and then assessing the risks and opportunities related. And then the last one is reporting it. So in terms of what this helps us to do, well, there's a famous old adage in finance that you can't manage something if you can't measure it, which is usually the beginning of most conversations with investment managers, and rightly so. And so, the purpose of LEAP more than anything is that it's about beginning that measurement process in a standardized way that will emerge over time. And at the moment, I've got phase 1 and phase 2 noted here, and this is the first really key concept that I want to introduce with regards to LEAP today, is that people will tend to do multiple passes of LEAP. And this is probably particularly true with regards to finance. So the first pass might be what you see in the middle there is phrased as exposure mapping. So this is where you could maybe do a screen across the whole portfolio about, okay, well, what sectors are most dependent and what sectors are having the biggest impact. And you can go through the LEAP process at that scale, at maybe a global scale or a regional scale or a sector level scale. And that's an interface with nature at that scale. And then that you could analyze that for its, well, what are the impacts and dependencies for agriculture or for mining and so on. And yeah, you could say a number of generic things, but still insightful things, still things that could inform the dialogue with the portfolio companies, and then you could assess that. You could assess what the upcoming transition risks were for that sector. So you could do that at that scale. And that's where a lot of financial institutions are today, which is great. They've done this, what we might call this first pass of LEAP, and we'll be talking about that a little later today as well. Like, how does that work? What are the tools to do that? What does that first pass look like? In terms of what's next, there is the opportunity to go, if you like, to a second pass of LEAP, to drop down a level, to maybe to where you've got location explicit information with regards to forestry assets, just as an example, but where you've got location-specific information, evaluating that interface with nature. Okay, so we hold these assets that have these specific locations, which have this interface, and then evaluating that and assessing that. So that would produce a slightly different set of analysis. So there's opportunities to operate at different scales to produce different levels of insight, all of which can inform dialogue with portfolio companies, can inform investment strategies, can inform risk management frameworks, and so on and so on. So that's where I think we see things headed, and that helps us move towards targets, policies, financial products. Okay, almost there. So yeah, as I said, like, this program is all about, these workshops over the course of the coming few months is all about empowering you. So we're looking to provide actionable guidance. The subsequent workshops will really be learning by doing. So we'll give you examples of how to measure impact, and then empower you to use the tools in the workshops themselves in a live setting to measure that impact. And equally, we'll do the same thing on the dependencies and financial risk sides too in a subsequent workshop. So it's really much learning by doing, and then having the opportunity to collaborate with peers. So those LEAP exercises are about empowerment, about producing insights to help you with decisions, and of course capacity gets built as a result. All right, and this is all this summed up. Okay, so the slide I've been talking about for a while now. Where are we going? What's the journey? So today, kind of we've phrased it as getting ready for LEAP. So getting everyone on the same plane. Appreciate there's going to be differing levels of familiarity here with the topic probably, but getting everyone on the same plane in terms of then doing a LEAP assessment, tools, concepts, etc. Then we're going to focus on the impact side. So we're going to focus on the impacts on nature and the resultant transition risks. So again, locate, evaluate, and assess, but specifically for impacts and transition risks. And then we're going to do the same thing for dependencies. So evaluating the dependencies and then assessing the physical risks that result from that. And then last of all, and this relates more to, if you like, the prepare and report phase, but also is all about making sure that what's being done here is actionable and useful for you. The last workshop will focus on facilitating and supporting the development of individualized action plans so that you can go away and implement some of what's been learned in your institutions. Yeah, this is what you've already seen today, so hopefully this is starting to make a little more sense, and we will be taking a little break for 10 minutes very soon, so we can get some coffee, and then this afternoon we'll be talking more about LEAP. All right, so key takeaways for this section. So the TNFD's created guidance that can be used to identify dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. LEA is already at portfolio level helping people to connect nature with finance and already being used to create some strategies and engagement plans. It will go further. And then, as I said, after this initial heat mapping, many people are now dropping down to sector level or individual asset level when they do these assessments in the financial community.